Well, today we're in the last message in our series entitled Human Misconceptions About God. And today we're looking at the topic of, is God cold-hearted? You've got a few notes on the back of your bulletins if you'll fill in some blanks this morning. Make notes as you see fit. I think this will be a very helpful time of study of God's Word. And the question that faces us today is this: is God cold-hearted? Is he distant? Another way of asking this question would be very simply, does God care about what's going on in my life, in our lives? Is he involved with what's going on in your life? Or did he, kind of like millions of years ago, just kickstart this universe and then kind of leave us all to fend for ourselves? Say, good luck with that. Because, let's be honest, it can feel that way some of the time, can't it? Much of the time. More and more, people have this kind of perception in our society today that God is not really available, that he's not really listening, that he can't really do anything, or he really doesn't care. And this is more than just an academic question. People are wrestling with this because of personal experience in their lives. Like when they have a prayer that goes unanswered for an extended period of time, or when suffering happens, or injustice goes seemingly overlooked for a long period of time, or when something happens that's just so tragic and so awful, and you're thinking, God, why didn't you do anything about that? I mean, you're God. You could have done something. I shared a prayer request with you last week for the family of one pastor in Pennsylvania who he passed away and ended a battle with cancer. And I'll give you an update today on Dr. Larry Rickard, our retired pastor from Paramount Baptist in Hagerstown. You'll need to pray for him over the next few days for sure, because he's going to have brain surgery at GW Hospital Tuesday morning. And people that are in situations like that, they will receive all kinds of visits from people and messages and cards, and they'll say, God is with you, we're praying for you, our God is able. But so many people in that position think to themselves, but what if he isn't? What if God isn't really listening? That he isn't taking notice of what I'm facing? What if he isn't able? What if God really doesn't give a rip about me and my situation? Now, this is not a new question. It's plagued mankind throughout human history. One of Israel's most beloved kings, King David, wrestled with this question. In Psalm 13, he puts it this way: how long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? And how long really means, how much longer am I going to have to endure this? David had been praying and praying and hoping and waiting for God to show up. So even the writers of Scripture have battled with this question: does God care? The main question in our day may not be, is God good? The main question for you and I may be, what good is he? You ever been in a place like that in your own personal life? I mean, many Christians are out there who once felt very close to God and that God was close to them. But they get to a point, because of life circumstances, where they're not so sure about that anymore. You've been praying, not just for days or weeks, but for months or years, and it just doesn't seem like God is ever going to answer. Maybe you've poured your life into a person or a relationship or a particular need in your community. But the problem never really seems to get better. It just seems to get worse and worse. Maybe you're facing a pain or a loss, or you've been battling with an addiction in your life or a habit. You've been going to church and you've been praying. You've been getting other people you know to pray for you and with you. You've been doing the right thing. But the question in the back of your mind is, where is God? One skeptic described it this way. He said these words, "You know, I can't prove that God doesn't exist, but my life can prove that he doesn't care." You know people like that? Have you been like that? Today we're going to look at a story in the Bible about three siblings, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And something happens in their family that challenges every ounce of their faith. It shakes the very foundation of their faith. And it leaves them wondering and asking the question, God, where are you? How could you let this happen? And I want us to walk through this story together. And through this story, we will find the answer to the question, is God cold-hearted? I mean, does he even care? It's found in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, and we'll start reading with verse 1. You can follow as I read if you'd like. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." The story begins, as many stories in the Gospels do, with someone coming to Jesus and asking for help. Happens all the time, right? But this story is a little unique because it's not just a request of a stranger or a request from a random person in a crowd. Jesus actually knows this family really, really well. Bethany was just a few miles east of Jerusalem, and when Jesus would travel from Galilee to Jerusalem, he often would stay with this family. They'd kind of hang out together and do life while he got a little rest in between trips. In fact, John tells us it's the same area as the one who poured perfume on Jesus' feet. Something that you won't see appear in that gospel until later. But John essentially wants us to know that this is the same family Jesus spends time with, he shares meals with, they sit around and laugh together, sometimes they cry together. They are very, very close. In fact, you'll notice that Mary and Martha didn't even have to mention the name of the sick person when they wrote. They just said this, "The one that you love is sick." That phrase can also be translated as the one who's your dear friend, or the one who is your absolute best friend is sick. Did you notice that they didn't even ask him for help? They just got to tell him what's happening. And it's as if they're saying, Jesus, you know us, we're close. We know what you are capable of doing. If anything were to ever happen to us, we knew that we could call you and you would come running. We knew of all people, you would care. Because that's how best friends are, right? When you love someone and they have a huge need, you don't stop and check your email, do you? You drop everything and you run and you show up. Jesus loved this family to death. I mean, he was so connected to them. In fact, in verse 5 in the story, Jesus tells us this explicitly when he says these words. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. But what is really surprising in this text is when we read what John writes when he says, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. He stopped and checked his email. 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, after the 2-day period, let us go back to Judea. Now wait a minute. Let me get this straight. Jesus hears of this family that he's super close to and that there's an emergency. And he says, I love this family with all my heart. I'm as close to them as anybody can be. And then he basically does nothing about it for 2 days? I mean, he's not really busy with anything else. The scripture doesn't indicate that anyway. There's no pressing preaching schedule. There's no engagements, you know. Jesus doesn't just wait. He waits until he knows Lazarus is already dead. John writes this. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. Believe? Believe what? That you don't care about your friends? That you'd rather be out somewhere else, you know, with the disciples addressing your needs instead of coming to the aid of your best friends? You know, it's interesting, the name Lazarus in Hebrew literally means, write this down, God has helped. Did you know that? But at this point in the story, it looks just the opposite, doesn't it? God hasn't helped. God didn't help. He didn't come running the moment he got the news. In fact, he stalled for 2 days. Folks, so much of our faith hinges on the space between the time we ask God for help and the question, when is he going to show up and do something? You find that to be true? For them it was, and it was a 2-day period. The space of time when God could have stepped in to heal this loved one, and the space of time where they had to sit there and watch it get much worse and more hopeless. Where was God? Why did he seem indifferent for 2 whole days? And that is really the question that we deal with in our lives as God makes us wait. Now, whether we like it or not, the first thing we need to see in this story is that Jesus did this for a reason. It was not an accident. It was not him being forgetful. He did it on purpose. This is something that Jesus wants us to believe about him that can only be accomplished after a delay. Jesus finally goes to Bethany, and when he arrives, he has 3 conversations. We're going to walk through each one of them. The first is with Martha. Martha, as you remember from some of the other stories in the scriptures about her, she's kind of this outgoing, extroverted sister. She's the in-your-face sister. I can just imagine that when they were all laughing together after a meal, and you know, she was the loudest. You could probably hear her out in the street. There's no surprise. When she hears that Jesus has arrived, she's the one who bolts out the door and is the first one to meet him. And here's what she says. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. In your face. Do you love the raw, confrontational honesty in her? I do. God, if you had just been here, you could have done something. In other words, you could have prevented this, God. Why didn't you? Can I tell you that sometimes the very best faith that you and I can muster is simply to be honest with God? Even if it sounds like complaining. Sometimes the beginning of faith is just raw honesty. I hear people say all the time, I don't think I know how to have faith in God. And I will say back to them, do you know how to be honest? Do you know how to express your feelings? Do you know how to be angry with God? It's a good place to start. God, if you had just been here, my career would never have stalled. God, if you had just been here, my kids would not be struggling with this drug addiction. God, if you had just done something, my heart wouldn't feel like it's got a hole in it right now the size of Texas. Like many of you, Martha's faith was shaken to the core, and she's looking for answers and something to grab hold of. And Jesus meets her right where she is, and he says to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha, kind of shifting into theological mode, says, okay, I get it. You know, I know we're all going to rise again, the resurrection and the last day. In other words, you know, I know there will be a day where God will do what he promises. I'm a faithful first century Jew. I get it. And Jesus says, no, 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 you're not getting it. He interrupts her and he says, your theology is correct, but what you're missing is what's really important here. And he says the words that no other first century rabbi would dare to say. He says these words, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. In other words, there's a kind of life that death cannot have victory over. There's a kind of life that's available only through me, Martha. You see, the reason that Jesus wasn't in a rush, the reason why it was fine to arrive when he wanted to, is because he wanted them to see the truth about who he was and expand their faith in him. I think it's very poignant that he uses the phrase, I am, in this reference. It's the way that God spoke about himself in the Old Testament when he said, I am who I am. He's saying, Martha, I am not just a good teacher. I am not just one of your best friends here. And I am not just a religious leader. I am God himself, the one who created the universe. I am the one who spoke everything into existence and gave everything life. I created love and friends and family and joy. I am the same God who made oceans and mountains and sunsets for your enjoyment. It kind of makes me think of that TV show, Undercover Boss. How many of you seen it? How many of you cry when you watch that show all the time? Me too. It's a show where the boss of the corporation kind of dresses up as one of the employees and mixes in with the lowest level of employees in the company. Jesus is kind of an undercover boss. You know, I showed up. You thought I was just a teacher or a rabbi, but you had no idea. Now watch me bless you. I didn't just come to improve your circumstances or make you feel better about your life for a moment. I came to conquer sin. I came to defeat death. I came to give you hope that transcends every circumstance you will ever face in this life. That's what I came for. And then he asks Martha this amazing question. He says, do you believe this? Do you really believe it? Do you trust me? Before he does anything, before he steps in, before he provides a miracle, he wants to know if she believes. You know, part of how we answer the question, does God care, is based on how we really answer the question, who do you think Jesus is, anyway? I mean, if you think he's just a great teacher, a spiritual leader, if he's just a voice for compassion or justice or love, then I'm here to tell you at the end of the day, that's not going to offer you a whole lot of hope, is it? It doesn't matter if he arrives on time or 2 days late or 2 years later. Sin is still sin, death is still death, and the grave is still the grave. But folks, he is so much more than that. What if he was 2 days late because sickness was not even an obstacle for him? What if he was 2 days late because death was not an obstacle for him? He says these words, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I'm glad I was not there. So now you can believe. Listen, in your life right now, whatever you're facing, he is more than you think he is. And I say that with every ounce of confidence within me. Do you believe it, though? Do you really trust him? No matter how bad it gets for you. Jesus told Martha who he was. He's given us a picture of who he really is and how we should believe, but sometimes our hearts need more than just the need to believe, don't they? I know mine does. Can I be real honest? I need more. Sometimes. And as Jesus is talking to Martha, he notices something. He notices that Mary isn't there. She's missing. Because she's still in the house grieving. And when I say grieving, she's beside herself. Mary knew Jesus was there, but she didn't even come out to see him. She's not confrontational like her sister. And her disappointment was so deep, so anguishing, she couldn't even face Jesus. Ever had a moment in your life like that? A moment where you said to yourself, you know, things have gotten so bad, I can't even pray. I don't even want to go to church on Sunday. And I don't want to face people who will give me the, oh, God is with you. I don't want to hear that. Now, there's another conversation that's needed here. So Jesus sends Martha to get Mary. And she says these words, the teacher is here. And he's asking for you. Have you ever had somebody come looking for you when you're down and discouraged? Do you want to be found? I go into hermit mode. That's what I call it. I said, I'm just going to sit at the house and hermitize. Maybe it's a phone call or a text and people are just checking in on you, you know, and you're thinking, yeah, okay, thanks, but no thanks. Folks, hear me when I tell you, no matter how deep the pain goes, God's grace can always go deeper. It really can. Mary comes out to meet him, and she literally falls at Jesus' feet, weeping. And she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It looks like the same thing that Martha said, but in the original language, there's a stronger emphasis from Mary when she says, my brother. She says, this is my brother we're talking about here. He would not have died. My brother. In other words, this is my pain. I own all of it. This is one of the people who matters the most to me in this life, Jesus. And his response, her response to him cuts him to the core. The text says this: when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also, they were weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Now wait a second. This is the same man who had the confidence to say, I'm the resurrection and the life. All you got to do is believe in me. And now it says he is deeply moved and troubled. How is that possible? And he asks her the question, where have you laid him? He had to meet Martha with some clarification about her faith too, but he was so much more compassionate in the way that he did it with her, because that's what she needed. He had to meet Mary on a heart-to-heart level. So Jesus goes to the tomb, the place where his very best friend is buried, and in the grave, and he falls to the ground. And he begins to cry and cry and cry. That's right, the one that had power over all of this is weeping like a baby. And in the first century, weeping was not a quiet, private, Kleenex to the nose moment. I'll be okay. Weeping meant wailing, folks. Weeping meant bawling your eyes out. Weeping at times meant screaming. In fact, he wails so loudly that everyone around him begins to take notice. He screams in such loud personal pain that he's having that people say, isn't this the guy who heals people? I mean, why on earth would he be so grieved? Why is he breaking down? Here's the answer, folks. Because he cared. That's the plain truth of it. Because he loved them all so very much, he saw their loss and their despair. And he didn't just come to show off his resurrection power, or because he needed them to believe something. He actually loved them so much that he felt the pain and the loss himself. That was his best friend in that grave, and he loved Lazarus like a brother. And the Jews who witnessed this said, oh, see how he loved them. See, it was more than what Jesus could do for them. He really did love them. He didn't weep because he lacked power. He wept because he was so full of compassion and concern for what was going on right before his very eyes. And in the moments like these, we see and discover clearly in our lives that God is not cold-hearted. He is broken-hearted. He weeps when you weep. His heart breaks when yours breaks. He feels what you feel. He suffers when you suffer. And he is probably seeing now and confronting everything that he came to destroy. He's confronting everything that he came to the earth to redeem and make right again. But Jesus isn't finished yet. He gets up, he goes to the tomb, and he says these words, roll the stone away. And Martha immediately goes, you have got to be kidding me. Lazarus has been buried for 4 days. What's significant about 4 days? Well, according to rabbinic teaching, when a person died, their soul remained in their body, are you ready for this? For 3 days. And on the 4th day, the soul would begin to leave. And after 4 days in the tomb, we knew that the soul had already left. Yeah, like we know. 4 days in the tomb meant not only was his soul gone, his flesh is beginning to decay. Nobody wants to be around that. That's just gross. What it means, Jesus, you're too late. Maybe if you arrived a day after, or maybe 2 days after, or maybe even 3 days after, you could have done something. But 4 days, Jesus, don't you dare roll away that stone. There's nothing that can be done. And Jesus calls out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And he did. The text says that the dead man came out alive. Can you imagine the shock on people's faces? Pretend you never saw Walking Dead. Can you imagine? I often wonder, did Lazarus speak after that? When he was coming out? Hey guys, I'm back. I think it probably was a little more innocent than that if he did say something. I think it was probably more like, what are you all looking at? Folks, hear me when I tell you this morning, just when you think God can't, God can. Just when you think God is 2 days late, He is right on time. For those 2 days, they wondered where God was. For those 2 days, they lived with crushing doubt and despair. And for 2 days, they wondered if God even cared. What is He, cold-hearted? You gotta be kidding me. Think of the stories that Lazarus had to share for the rest of his earthborn life. Second one. Hey, did I ever tell you about the time? Yeah, Lazarus, we've heard it about 4 dozen times. Go ahead, tell it again. Folks, God is always up to something bigger than you can see right now. That's the truth. I'm going to say it again because it's that important. God is always up to something bigger than you can see right now. The Apostle Paul puts it this way later. He says, for now we see only a reflection in a mirror, but then we will see face to face. Now is like those 2 painful days of waiting. Now is like trying to look in a mirror that's steamed up from your shower in the bathroom in the morning that you can't even see your reflection in. But one day, that mirror is going to be as clean and as clear and crisp. You'll see everything. One day you will know why God did what He did, why there was a delay. There's a former professor of theology at Yale by the name of Nicholas Walterstorff. He lost his son, Eric, who was 25 years old in a rock climbing accident where he fell to his death. And over the next year, the professor wrote a series of essays reflecting on his pain and his personal experience of losing his son. He later published a book called Lament for a Son. And in it, he wrote about that horrible moment that he got a phone call and heard the news that his son was dead. He wrote about the pain that he had and the pain that he and his family still live with to this day. He says it'll never fully go away. He wrote about his own questions about God. God, why did you allow this? God, why didn't you do something? He wrote these words that I want to share with you for just a moment. As he buried his son in an earthly grave for what seemed to him to be like forever. Here's what he wrote. An excerpt from the book. It says, I wonder how it will all go when God raises my son and the rest of us from the dead. Giving us new bodies seems no great problem to Him. But how's He going to fit us all together in heaven? I mean, my son Eric here from the 20th century has to be fit in with someone from long ago who lived in very primitive conditions, knowing nothing of airplanes or electricity or neutron bombs, knowing only of a patch of soil which she tended from the day she became an adult, and she never really strayed more than about 5 miles from that patch of land. Will God have everyone learn about what's happened over the ages? About computers? Eric would have had a head start. He was pretty good with them. But what about the different characters and temperaments of all these people that they'll bring to heaven? So many people over the ages, and I see them stretching so far back, their faces eventually become a brownish blur, haze from here. But God somehow has them all in mind. I don't see how he's going to bring it off. But I suppose if he can create, he can recreate. I wonder sometimes if it's all true. I wonder if he's really going to do it. Will I hear Eric say someday, like Lazarus may have, "Hey, Dad, I'm back." But I remember God said, "I made all of this. And I raised my son from the dead so that yours could be raised too." So goodbye, Eric. Goodbye. Until I see you again. Folks, someday you're going to see how much God has cared for you over the years. How much he was really doing behind the scenes. How much love he has for you. How much grace and compassion he has extended to you. And if you will trust him, if you will hang on and cling to him in faith, one day you'll see it all as clear as possible. I'm here to tell you this morning, God did not just kickstart this world and this universe into existence and then leave a note for you and I saying, "Good luck. Fend for yourselves." No, God came into this world. He suffered with us. He went to a cruel cross and died on it to pay for our sin debt that we could never pay. He went to a grave, and on the third day, that God-man came out and said, "Hey, Dad, I'm back." Would you stand for prayer?